The drive from Thunder Bay takes about 18 hours if you don't stop. I stopped twice. Once for gas outside Sudbury, once because I had to pull over on the 400 and just sit there with my hands on the wheel, staring at the gray Ontario sky, trying to slow my heartbeat down to something that wouldn't kill me before I got there. It had been 2 years and 4 months since I'd been back to the house on Birchwood Crescent. 2 years and 4 months since I'd kissed my son on the cheek in the driveway, told him I'd call every Sunday, and driven north to take care of my sister Carol, who'd had a stroke and couldn't manage alone. 2 years and 4 months since I'd left my daughter Claire behind in the house her father and I had owned for 31 years. I'm 64 years old. I've buried a husband, raised 2 children largely on my own after the divorce, and kept a 3-bedroom house in Barrie running on a teacher's pension since I retired 6 years ago. I am not a woman who panics easily. But somewhere around Parry Sound, with the pines pressing in dark on both sides of the highway, I felt something cold settle in my chest that I couldn't shake. The last time I'd spoken to Claire properly was 11 weeks ago. Since then, my calls went to voicemail. My texts received 2 or 3 words back, sometimes the next day. Fine, busy, talk soon. Her voice, when she did answer, was flat and careful, the way it used to get when she was a teenager, and didn't want me to know she'd been crying. What finally made me get in the car was a phone call from her friend Nadine. Nadine had known Claire since they were 8 years old, sitting in the same grade 3 classroom at Allendale Heights. They'd been inseparable until a few years ago, when things changed. Nadine called me on a Wednesday evening, and when I heard her voice, I knew immediately it wasn't a social call. She said she'd been trying to reach Claire for 6 weeks. Said the last time she saw her, running into her by chance at the Zares on Bayfield Street, Claire had looked through her like she wasn't there, turned and walked the other way. Nadine followed her to the parking lot, touched her arm, and Claire flinched so hard she dropped her grocery basket. That was 3 months ago. Nadine hadn't been able to reach her since. I hung up the phone, sat at Carol's kitchen table in Thunder Bay for about 4 minutes, then called my son Michael in Vancouver and told him I was driving to Barrie. He said he'd fly out. I told him to wait. Let me see what I'm walking into first. I should have gone sooner. I knew that before I even reached the city limits. Mothers always know. We tell ourselves stories about not wanting to interfere, not wanting to insert ourselves, respecting our adult children's choices. But underneath all those reasonable explanations is the thing we don't say out loud. Sometimes we're afraid of what we'll find. I turned onto Birchwood Crescent at 7:30 on a Thursday morning. The maple I'd planted in the front yard the year we moved in was enormous now, its November branches bare and reaching. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe just sadder. The eaves troughs were pulling away from the roofline on the left side. The garden beds were choked with dead growth that hadn't been cut back. The driveway had 2 cars I didn't recognize, a black pickup truck and a silver SUV with a cracked rear bumper. My Subaru was not in the driveway. Claire's car was not in the driveway. I sat in my rental for a moment. My sister's partner had driven me to the airport in Thunder Bay at 4 in the morning and I'd flown to Toronto, then driven the rental north. I was exhausted, and my back ached, and I wanted more than anything a cup of tea and my daughter's face. I got out of the car. I still had my key on the same ring I'd carried for 20 years, between the library fob and the little brass charm Michael gave me the year he graduated from UBC. I let myself in the front door. The smell hit me first. Cigarette smoke, old and embedded in the walls, which was strange because Claire didn't smoke and I'd never allowed it in the house. Underneath that, something cooking, and beneath that, a heaviness I can only describe as too many people in a space that wasn't built for them. The front hall was cluttered with shoes. Boots mostly, large ones, men's work boots and a pair of women's fashion boots with a broken zipper, children's sneakers in 2 different sizes. A child's backpack hung from the coat hook where my father's old fishing jacket used to live. I stood very still and listened. Voices from the kitchen. A television on somewhere upstairs. The high pitch of a child complaining about something, and a woman's voice telling them to keep it down. I walked down the hall. The runner my husband Robert and I had bought at a market in Kensington when we were newly married was dark with ground-in dirt. The framed prints on the wall were gone, replaced with nothing, just pale rectangles where they'd hung. The kitchen had 4 people in it, A heavy-set man in his 40s sitting at my kitchen table eating toast, his work jacket still on like he'd just come in or was about to leave. A woman around the same age at the counter pouring coffee. 2 children, maybe 6 and 9, eating cereal at the breakfast bar where Claire used to do her homework. None of them were Claire. None of them were anyone I'd ever seen. The man looked up first. His expression shifted through surprise, then a kind of flat assessment, then something harder. I said, "Excuse me," and my voice came out steadier than I felt. The woman at the counter turned around. She had her hair pulled back, and she was wearing a housecoat over her clothes. The kind of thing you wear when you're completely comfortable somewhere. Comfortable enough to forget it's not your home. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question exactly, more like a challenge. "I'm Dorothy Hewson," I said. "This is my house. Who are you?" The man put his toast down. The woman's expression shifted. She said, "This is Ryan's place. I'm his mother, Sandra. He told us we could stay here while we got back on our feet. If you're one of Claire's friends, you'll want to talk to Ryan." Ryan. I knew who Ryan was. Ryan Kowalski, 38 years old, whom Claire had been seeing for 2.5 years. I'd met him 4 times. Each time he'd been charming in the specific way of people who are performing charm rather than feeling it, complimenting my house, agreeing with everything I said, touching Claire's arm a little too often, a little too firmly. "Where is my daughter?" I said. "She's at work," Sandra said, turning back to her coffee. "She starts early. Ryan's upstairs if you want to talk to him." "What time does she finish?" I asked. The woman shrugged. 4, I think. Maybe 5. She works long hours. Claire was a dental hygienist at a practice on Dunlop Street. She'd been there for 9 years. I happened to know she worked Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 3, and took Mondays for administrative work. This was Thursday. She should have left around 8:30. I asked where Ryan was, and the woman gestured at the ceiling. I went upstairs. The door to the room that had been Claire's since she was 17 was closed. I could hear a podcast playing inside, and the particular silence of someone not doing much of anything. I knocked once and opened the door. Ryan was in bed. It was 7:45 in the morning and he was lying on top of the covers in yesterday's clothes scrolling through his phone. He sat up fast when he saw me, and I watched several expressions cross his face in quick succession. Surprise. Then something calculated. Then the performance of being pleased to see me. "Dorothy," he said. "Wow. We weren't expecting you." "Clearly," I said. I looked around the room. Claire's things were mostly gone. The bookshelf she'd had since university. The small watercolor her friend had painted of the Penetanguishene Harbor. The photographs on the dresser. Ryan's clothes were on the chair, on the floor, draped over the closet door. His gaming setup occupied the desk where Claire used to keep her work files. "Where is Claire sleeping?" I asked. He paused just a beat too long. "We've been using the spare room," he said. She wanted more space for her stuff. I turned and walked down the hall. The spare room, which had been a proper guest room with a double bed and a white duvet, had been converted into something else entirely. The bed was gone. A pull-out cot, the cheap foam kind, was folded up against the wall. Claire's things were in here, what remained of them. A few boxes, a laundry basket with her clothes, her toiletries bag sitting on the floor beside the cot because there was no dresser. The closet held her work clothes. That was all. My daughter, who had lived in this house for 2 years, had been reduced to a cot in what was effectively a storage room. The rest of the house was occupied by Ryan's mother, Ryan's brother Kevin and Kevin's family, and Ryan himself sleeping in her bedroom, and my daughter was on a cot in the corner. I went back to Ryan's room. He was still sitting on the bed, watching me with that careful look. He started talking before I could. He said things had been tight since his contracting business slowed down. Said his family needed a place temporarily. Said Claire had been totally on board with the arrangement, that she understood family came first, that she'd suggested the spare room herself because she went to bed earlier than everyone else. The words came out smooth and practiced, the kind of story that gets polished from telling it over and over, to yourself most of all. I asked about the mortgage. He blinked. "What about it?" I said. "This house has no mortgage. Robert and I paid it off before he passed. There shouldn't be any mortgage on it." Something moved behind his eyes. "Dorothy," he said, "there have been some expenses. The furnace needed replacing last winter. The roof had some damage. Claire and I made some decisions together about how to handle that. I asked him to show me the paperwork. He said Claire handled all the financial stuff. I said I'd like to see it anyway. He said he'd have to find it. I told him I'd wait downstairs. I went to the kitchen and sat at my own kitchen table. Sandra refilled her coffee without offering me any. The children finished their cereal and went upstairs. The man in the work jacket, Kevin presumably, left without saying anything to me. I sat with my hands flat on the table that Robert and I had bought at a garage sale the year Michael was born, sanded and refinished ourselves on a long weekend in August, and I waited. I texted Michael. "I'm inside. It's bad. Not yet. Wait." I waited 5.5 hours. Sandra moved around the kitchen like I wasn't there. She made lunch for the children. She watched something on her phone. She spoke to me once, to say that she didn't know why I'd shown up unannounced, that it was disruptive for the kids. I didn't respond. Around 1 o'clock, Ryan came downstairs, showered and more composed. He sat across from me and tried to have a conversation about boundaries and family and how Claire was doing really well, actually, all things considered. I listened without saying much. I watched his eyes. I watched his hands. I've taught long enough to know when someone is managing a situation versus telling the truth. He was managing. At 3:40, I heard a car in the driveway. The front door opened and my daughter came in. I almost didn't know her. Claire has always looked like her father. Same dark eyes, same way of holding her shoulders. She's 36, younger than she should look by about a decade. Or she was. The woman who came through that door was thin in a way that hollowed out her cheeks. She was wearing her work clothes, navy scrubs, and they were too big now, hanging off her. Her hair was pulled back, but not in the careful way she used to do it, just gathered and fastened with an elastic. She had the particular wariness of a person who has learned to read a room for danger before they've even taken their coat off. She saw Ryan first, then Sandra, then me. Her work bag hit the floor. She said, "Mom," and it came out like something breaking. I stood up. I crossed the kitchen and I put my arms around her and she went rigid for a moment, the way people do when they've been braced for so long that being held feels foreign. Then she pressed her face into my shoulder and shook. Ryan's voice came from behind me. He said something about giving us a minute, and there was an edge in it, a warning buried inside the reasonable words. I turned and looked at him over my daughter's head. I said, "Why don't you and your mother give us some time alone?" He looked at me for a moment, then took his phone from his pocket and walked into the living room. Sandra followed. I held my daughter in my own kitchen for a long time. When she could speak, I asked her to come with me. She said she couldn't leave. Dinner needed to be made. Ryan's parents were coming for the weekend. She hadn't finished the laundry. I said, "The laundry can wait." She said, "Ryan gets upset when things aren't done." I said, "You are coming with me right now." She looked toward the living room. Then she looked at me. Then she picked up her work bag and her keys and we walked out the front door. Ryan appeared at the end of the hallway as we left. He called Claire's name once, and something in how he said it made her grip my arm. I didn't look back. I took her to the Marriott on Dunlop, the one near the waterfront. I checked us into a room with 2 beds, and I ordered from the Thai place that delivered, and I sat on the edge of the bed across from my daughter and I said, "Tell me everything. Take as long as you need." It took 3 hours. It had started small, the way these things apparently always do. Ryan lost a major contract 14 months ago, a construction job in Innisfil that had kept him busy for 2 years. He told Claire it was temporary, that the industry was slow, that he had leads. The leads didn't materialize. Months passed. The savings account they shared, which Claire had contributed to steadily from her own paycheck, began to drain. His brother Kevin and Kevin's wife lost their rental in Aurelia when their landlord sold the property. Ryan invited them to stay for a few weeks. A few weeks became indefinitely. Kevin wasn't working either. His wife worked part-time at a coffee shop in town. The children were enrolled in school in Barrie, which made leaving feel permanent. Then Ryan's mother Sandra's lease came up, and she couldn't afford the renewal. Ryan invited her too. Suddenly, there were 7 people in a 3-bedroom house, and the only one with a steady income was Claire. When she raised it, gently, carefully, choosing a quiet evening when Ryan seemed in a good mood, he told her she was being selfish, said his family was in crisis and she was worried about her own comfort, said his mother had done everything for him growing up, And didn't she think he owed her something? Said Claire was exactly like her own mother, always judging, never giving enough. She'd stopped raising it. The bedroom had been next. Ryan said he needed proper sleep for his job search, that Claire's early schedule was waking him up, that it made more sense for her to use the spare room where she wouldn't disturb him. She'd moved her things over a weekend while he was out, telling herself it was practical, that it was temporary, that things would improve. The cot was because Kevin's kids needed the guest bed when they visited, which had become permanent. Her own double bed was now in the spare room, but Kevin's children shared it when they were home from school sick, which was often. She told me about the joint account, which now had her salary going in and coming out almost immediately, distributed across expenses that kept growing. Groceries for 7 people, Kevin's gas money because Kevin needed his truck for when work came through, Sandra's prescription because Sandra had a bad back, Ryan's software subscription for his portfolio, her own work expenses, her scrub replacements and her license renewal paid last after everything else. She had $60 in her personal account. She'd had it for 3 weeks, spent carefully, not touching it, because it was the only thing that was only hers. She told me she'd stopped seeing Nadine because Ryan felt Nadine was negative, didn't support their relationship. She'd stopped seeing her other friends for similar reasons, one by one, each departure framed around something they'd done or said that Ryan had found problematic. She'd reduced herself to the space of a cot and a laundry basket and $60, and she'd done it so gradually she hadn't seen it happening. She looked at me across the hotel bed with those hollow eyes and said, "I kept thinking you had enough to deal with. Aunt Carol was so sick. Dad's already gone. I thought I could manage it. I thought it would get better." I held her face in my hands. I said, "Listen to me carefully. That house belongs to me. It is registered in my name, in a family trust your father and I set up in 2009. Claire is listed as the beneficiary, but the property itself cannot be sold or mortgaged without my direct authorization. It doesn't matter what Ryan told you or showed you. He cannot touch that house. Do you understand me?" She stared at me. "But there are expenses," she said. "He said we had to cover the furnace and the roof, and he talked about remortgaging. Did you sign anything?" I asked. She thought for a long time. "He put some papers in front of me once. Said it was home equity documentation, standard stuff." I was upset, she said quietly. He'd been angry that week, and I just wanted it to be over. I signed something. I didn't read it properly. I called my lawyer that night, Margaret Osei, who had handled Robert's estate and had known me since my teaching days when she was a parent at my school. I told her everything. There was a pause, and then she said, "Dorothy, if he used forged or coerced documentation to access a property he has no legal claim to, that's fraud. If he used Claire's signature under duress for a financial product, that compounds it. This is serious." She said she'd have papers ready by the following morning. She also said, "Please contact the police tonight if you feel Claire is in any danger returning to that house." I didn't sleep much. Claire slept for 11 hours in the bed across from me, the deep, bottomless sleep of someone who has been running on nothing for a very long time. In the morning, I drove to Service Ontario when it opened and confirmed the property records. The house was in the family trust, my name as trustee, exactly as Robert and I had arranged. Then I went to our bank branch on Dunlop Street and spoke with a manager who confirmed that a home equity line of credit application had been submitted against the property 18 months ago, declined because the property was in trust, and the applicant had no authority over it. Ryan had tried. The bank had caught it. Then I went to the Barrie Police Service on Sheck Street. The officer I spoke with was a constable named James Thibio, methodical and calm, who listened to everything I said and looked at the documentation Margaret had emailed me, and then looked at the bank's letter confirming the declined application and said, "Ma'am, what you're describing is attempted mortgage fraud. The coerced signature on that document your daughter mentioned is also a concern. I'd like to send someone with you this afternoon." He sent Constable Amara Asante, a woman in her 30s with precise posture and a way of making the situation feel contained without minimizing it. We drove to Birchwood Crescent at 1 in the afternoon in 2 vehicles, mine and hers. Ryan came to the door when he saw the cruiser in the driveway. His face did something complicated. I didn't give him time to speak. I told him that I had documentation confirming the property at this address was registered in my name under a family trust, that he had no legal claim to the residence, and that I was formally asking him and his family to vacate within 48 hours. I handed him the letter Margaret had drafted. Constable Asante stood beside me and said nothing, which was more effective than anything she could have said. He said we couldn't do this. He said Claire had agreed to everything. He said his mother was sick and his brother had kids, and did we understand what we were asking? Constable Asante spoke. She said she understood this was a difficult situation, but that the property documentation was clear, and that he would want to cooperate voluntarily rather than have the matter escalate. She mentioned the declined mortgage application. She mentioned the question of the document Claire had signed under duress. She said these were matters that could become criminal in nature, and she trusted he understood what that meant. The color left his face. Sandra appeared behind him, trying to look imperious, and Constable Asante looked at her pleasantly and said the notice applied to all residents of the property. We left them in the doorway. In the car, Constable Asante said, "You know, we don't often see someone this organized when they come in. You had everything." I told her I'd been a teacher for 32 years. I said when you spend that long managing situations where people try to tell you you're wrong when you know you're right, you learn to have your paperwork in order. She laughed. I hadn't expected to, and it surprised me. Claire was in the hotel when I got back. She'd showered again and eaten the leftover pad see ew, and she was sitting cross-legged on the bed looking at her phone when I came through the door, and her face when I told her was something I will carry for the rest of my life. Not just relief, something more fundamental than that. The look of a person who had been told that the solid ground they thought had disappeared was still there after all. They'd just been moved off it. She said, "They're really leaving?" I said, "They're really leaving." She said, "What if Ryan—" And I said, "Ryan has 48 hours and a police witness to his situation. He'll leave." He did. It took closer to 60 hours than 48, and Constable Asante made a follow-up call on the second morning that I suspect helped accelerate things, but by Saturday afternoon, the black pickup and the silver SUV were gone. Kevin's family took a minivan load of belongings and drove back toward Aurelia. Sandra took a taxi somewhere. Ryan left last, a single carload, not looking at the house as he pulled out. Claire and I stood on the front step and watched him go. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I forgot what it felt like to be outside this house without being afraid of coming back to it." We spent 2 weeks cleaning. Not just cleaning, reclaiming. We pulled the cigarette smoke out of the curtains, washed every surface, replaced the runner in the hallway that had been ground into ruin. We got the eavesdrows refastened. Claire's friend Nadine came over on the second weekend, and I stayed out of the way while they sat in the kitchen for 4 hours, and when I came back down, Claire had been crying, but she was also laughing, and Nadine was too, and I made tea, and the three of us sat there until 10 at night. Margaret filed a report with the police regarding the attempted mortgage fraud and the document Claire had signed. The bank's records were useful. Ryan's own application, submitted against a property he demonstrably had no authority over, was difficult to explain away. I won't discuss the details of what came from that, but I'll say the district attorney's office in Simcoe County found the matter worth pursuing and that Ryan Kowalski no longer lives in Barrie. Claire filed for a peace bond. The justice of the peace granted it on the first application, which Margaret said was relatively uncommon and spoke to the clarity of the circumstances. Claire went back to her practice on Dunlop Street. Her colleagues had noticed the change in her over the past year and a half, the weight loss and the flinching, and the way she'd stopped making plans. Her practice manager, a woman named Grace who'd known Claire since she started there, told her she'd been worried for months. Claire started eating lunch again, properly, with Grace and the other hygienists, instead of alone in her car. She started seeing a therapist through the Employee Assistance Program. Once a week, then twice. She asked me to come to one session, and I did, and I sat across from a quiet woman named Dr. Ferreira and talked about the 2 years I'd been in Thunder Bay, telling myself Claire sounded a little off, but that she was an adult and I shouldn't insert myself, and I understood by the end of that hour that guilt doesn't help anyone, but sitting with it quietly is also not the same as dealing with it. Michael flew in from Vancouver in December, 6 weeks after everything. He and Claire and I had Christmas in the house on Birchwood Crescent for the first time in 3 years. We put up the tree, the old artificial one from the basement that I've had since the children were small, with the mismatched ornaments they each made in various school art classes. We had turkey and butter tarts and we watched It's a Wonderful Life on the old television in the living room. And when Claire fell asleep on the couch with her feet tucked under her and a cup of tea going cold on the side table, Michael looked at me and said, "She looks like herself again." She did. She's still working on it, and I think she will be for a while. There are evenings when something sets her off, a certain tone of voice or a message she didn't expect, and I'll find her sitting very still and carefully breathing. We don't rush past those moments anymore. We sit in them until they pass. I've decided not to go back to Thunder Bay permanently. Carol is doing better, well enough for home care support that the province provides, and she has neighbors who check in, and her partner is there. She told me when I called to tell her I was staying in Barrie that it was about time, that she'd worried about Claire the same as I had, but hadn't wanted to say. I should have said something sooner, I told her. "You're saying something now," Carol said. "That's what matters. It's February as I'm telling you this. The maple in the front yard is bare, and the street is banked with the particular gray-white snow that comes after weeks of freeze and thaw and freeze again. I'm in the kitchen with a cup of tea, and Claire is upstairs getting ready for work, and I can hear her moving around and the sound of the radio she turns on every morning, the CBC playing something I don't recognize. I think about Robert sometimes, about what he would have done. He was a quieter person than me, more inclined to wait and observe, but he loved Claire with a fierceness that surprised people who didn't know him. I think he would have been in the car a long time before I was. I don't say that to punish myself. I say it because I think it's important to be honest about the things we tell ourselves when we don't want to see what's in front of us. I told myself Claire was fine because I needed her to be fine. I told myself she was an adult and would ask for help when she needed it, because I knew, somewhere underneath, that what I might find if I looked too closely would require something from me I didn't know if I had. It turns out I had it. It turns out you usually do. If you are watching this and you are a mother or a father or a sister or a friend, and you have someone in your life who sounds a little off on the phone, who texts back in 2 or 3 words, who seems to be disappearing into someone else's version of their life, please listen to that feeling. Don't let the reasonable explanations talk you out of what you know. Drive the 18 hours. Let yourself in the front door. Sit at the kitchen table for 5.5 hours if you have to. I came home. My daughter is standing in her own kitchen making her own coffee. The house is ours, that's enough, that's everything.